Hey everyone, Matt Sitter, CEO of AFN here. Really excited to see and hear from you all again. At AFN, our central tenet is that change is where opportunity happens, and the best way to find opportunity in change is a network that's diverse in experience, expertise, and perspective. The discussions that we have when we bring a subject matter expert in, that's meant to stretch our brains so that we're thinking about things in a new and different way. Today, really excited to have Jim Rottman with us. He's currently global head of culture and inclusion at Volvo in Sweden. He's had a lot of big jobs in this type of area. He was head of people and culture at Roche, senior HR leader at Amex, amongst other organizations. And we're going to be talking a lot about what's going on with DEI right now and being able to bring in a few different perspectives against that. The things that I want to frame us on around this is ultimately we're all looking for how do we turn people into our best possible advantage. And Jim spends a ton of time thinking about how do we attract, retain, and best use top talent. So that's where our focus is going to be. Jim, welcome, and I'll put up some slides for you that you can go through. The format of today, Jim's going to go through slides, probably about 20 minutes. I'll ask him some questions, and then we're going to have an opportunity to ask questions along the way. I will let you know when there's an opportunity to come up on video. So I'm going to share my screen, Jim, and then floor is yours.
Great, thanks, Matt, and I appreciate being part of AFN's network. It's really valuable, and so if anybody has a chance to learn more about it, be part of it, take that opportunity. So I'm going to spend about 15-20 minutes, like Matt said, just kind of going through some stuff. It's about is DEI going away? As people probably know, if they're part of this conversation now, is that it's a hot conversation, and there's probably not a clear answer of is DEI going away, but there is, in my mind, some very clear direction that is happening, and that I think it's an opportunity for companies and for CEOs and for board of directors to actually take a look at what they're doing and think about how it fits better with their business. And so what I want to do is the slides that will be available to anybody after this presentation are pretty dense, because I wanted to put a lot of information on there. So if people wanted to use them in some way, or if people couldn't attend, then they'd have the real content behind it. So let's get started. We can talk about it. Go to the next slide. So first, I just want to ground everybody in what we're talking about and what DEI is. And this is a pretty general description. It works. I've worked both in the US leading diversity, as well as in Europe now, both out of Roche in Switzerland, but also with Volvo cars here in Sweden. And so this is a definition that tends to work globally. And so when we talk about diversity, some people like to talk about it as differences. And what I like to talk about is uniqueness. So that includes all the wide spectrums from individuals from various backgrounds to multiple perspectives, to better decision outcomes, and see people who they are. But the real point around the diversity is not just for representation for its own sake. And then equity and equality is a term that people sometimes interchange, but I'm going to talk a little bit about equity. And that is really treating people fairly. And it's giving everybody that equal opportunity. One such example is when people use resumes and then they blind the name, or they blind some of the other information, so people don't become some of their biases to unintentionally cause discrimination against any group. And there's actually a lot of research that shows that when people put different names on resumes, you get different responses. So this is one of the ways that we talk about how equity actually happens in a company. And the last one is inclusion, and that's about the environment, which everyone feels that they can belong and be heard. What's interesting to me is the word belonging. I haven't included it in here, but when it first started being used about half a dozen years ago, I really kind of, even myself, kind of rolled my eyes and said, why are we introducing more terms? Why are we using words that maybe the business doesn't really understand? And so when they came around with talking about inclusion and belonging, I was kind of like, I'm not sure if I want to go that direction. But I've had a huge change of heart and mind about this. When I really started looking into it, belonging is super critical, because if you look at it in Maslow's hierarchy of needs, it is actually in that lower part of the foundation of the pyramid. And so it is a foundational piece that people need to feel safe, and for people to feel like they're connected to something bigger. And so at Volvo, we added belonging to what we talk about, and it's been a foundation for what we do going forward. Next slide. I want to give a couple contexts, because I wasn't sure who was going to be on the call, but I think it's important to understand if it's going away or not, is to understand how we got here. And this is very high level, but it really starts at the beginning of some of the civil rights acts in 1964, which really looked at prohibiting discrimination. And then there was the creation of the equal employment opportunity. And that was really the start of it. But what happened when the EEOC became a real government entity, employees started filing discrimination lawsuits. And companies had to respond to that in some way. And so they began some diversity strategies, which back then was pretty much doing just diversity training. And it was at that core level of awareness of just what are we talking about, real basic stuff. And then President Kennedy came in and decided to look at affirmative action. And it was never meant to be discriminatory in any way, but it was to take a look at the barriers and the biases that were stopping people from moving either into companies or up in companies or getting into colleges, is to make sure that, again, back to that equity, that everybody had an opportunity to move forward. And colleges and universities use that affirmative action to boost enrollment of underrepresented students, and we're very, very effective at it. And then in 2020, George Floyd's death obviously sparked a firestorm across the world about a renewed interest in having a more diverse, equitable, and inclusive organization, as well as Black Lives Matter. But what's interesting is that between 2019 and 2022, this came from LinkedIn. There was 168.9 growth in chief diversity officer roles. So there was an explosion of roles. D&I Global Leaders, which is a UK-based organization, did a survey recently for all the DEI leaders in Europe and Asia. And what they found was that 70% of them had been in that role for less than 2 years. And so it was a lot of people coming into these roles with a lot of passion, a lot of learned and lived experience, but may not have been the best person to be in there to drive culture change, behavior change at the senior level, and to fully engage an organization. And today, if you look at ZipRecruiter, they've said that DEI job postings have fell 63% last year. You can look in LinkedIn, you can look in Indeed. Some of those numbers are higher than that. Some of those are lower than that. But what you're seeing is that there was kind of a peak in those years, 2019, 2022, and it's dropped off in 2023. So that must indicate something. It's data, and it's giving us something to think about. Is like, where are we going with this? When we go, yeah, next slide. Thanks, Matt. Is because I want to talk about this from a global perspective. I think it's interesting from a European context. And when the concept of being woke, it really is less relevant in Europe context. And DEI is much more framed around the social cohesion. It really is more focused about social mobility in organizations, around bringing people into the middle class. It is also about legal compliance. And if anybody on this call has ever worked in Europe, the EU has a lot of directives on things like gender pay, on percentage of women in board. It's on human rights. It's on the new sustainability, what they call CSRD reporting, about what you have to report on. So there's a lot of legal compliance where people are doing this because it's required. But there's also, they look at it from a business benefit rather than just social activism. And what you see in Europe is that it's the multinational companies that tend to push more and more on the broader D&I issues, and the focus on gender and on leadership and on LGBT, but a big focus on pay equity across Europe is primarily there. But they're starting to do more emphasis, and for me, this is the fascinating piece, is that they're starting to do more emphasis on ethnicity and cultural diversity. And sometimes they frame that as nationalities, because countries are getting more and more immigration from either climate change, from war, from conflicts. So this aspect of immigration is big, and how do companies handle that? And so now there's this tension that you see between national identity and trying to preserve that national identity and multiculturalism. And you can see that in many of the countries where they're starting to require that you understand and speak the language before you can have a long-term permanent residency. They're having, here in Sweden, they're having it so that you actually have to pay people a certain amount in order for them to be able to work here, because they don't want to bring in low-wage people from outside of the country. And then they're trying to balance, like I said before, that EU-wide directive around national sovereignty and social issues. Sweden and other countries, even though it's an EU directive, can usually get things delayed if they want to for a year or two before they ultimately have to comply with certain things. So there's always that balance. So why is this a conversation now? And I find this fascinating is that the arguments are coming from many critics. One of them, and many of them, are claiming reverse discrimination, that by putting quotas and targets on race, and it started with the universities and the admissions process, that there was reverse discrimination. And that instead of DEI looking at it from an equality or equity perspective, they were actually looking at it in a more biased way. Also, there was concern about this merit-based system being undermined. And what you hear is that people were being promoted or hired just because of their background or their race, and it was primarily to hit targets. And then you have a number of politicians and institutes that start talking about this as it's a partisan issue, and it's anti-American, because what they feel is that in America, it is everybody should be treated equally. So by doing this, then you're treating certain people in a special way. Of course, probably everybody on this call has seen all the arguments from the research out there from McKinsey and Deloitte, and we can go through a whole number of them. But the benefit is actually it increases organizational adaptability and innovation. It really enhances market and improves the talent attraction and retention. So what's happening in the news today that keeps this thing popping up? Bill Ackman did a 4,000-word critique on formerly Twitter X in a very non-positive way about how it's going in the wrong direction. Elon Musk has said DEI is just another word for racism. I think he's even said DEI must DIE. And now he's come up with another one on, I think it's called MEI, which is around meritocracy and intelligence, and I forget what the E stands for, like exceptionalism. Mark Cuban tries to take a much more progressive view and says DEI doesn't mean you don't hire on merit, but you do. And what it means is that you actually expand the possible pool of candidates as wide as you can. And so Mark takes a much more basic business approach to this, which is like, how do I build a sustainable business? And now with Kamala Harris, the presumptive president, from the Democrat side, he's now started to talk, and it's actually a slur, is to say that Kamala is a DEI hire, which means that she was never qualified to begin with. So it's interesting how they're taking this and using it from a number of different ways to attack people and to attack the work that's going on. Next slide. And so how are companies kind of responding to this in the news? Well, Microsoft did a layoff, which got published, that said that they've laid off their whole DEI team, and that everything had been deprioritized because it was no longer business relevant. Well, and it turned out it was only 2 people. And what they were doing was not in the DEI group at all, but also there was some redundancy in terms of the roles that they have. So this had never had anything to do with the DEI, but the press really wanted to talk about it in this way. Tractor Supply and John Deere, both of them have retracted their diversity, equity, inclusion programs. And I believe that John Deere gave the examples that they're no longer going to be celebrating the different diversity pieces like Pride Month or Hispanic or Disability Month, or they're going to stop doing those. And they did it because of how they thought their customers would respond to it. Google and Meta have both downsized their teams dramatically. And Zoom laid off their entire DEI team, claiming that they're changing approach, but they never talked about what that approach was. And legally, there's been over 85 anti-DEI bills introduced in 28 states since 2023, and 14 of them have been signed into laws in Texas and Florida. And so you can see that this isn't just a conversation, it's actually an impact that's happening, and both from a broader perspective, but also legal perspective. And so I wanted to take a look like why this matters and use some data to talk about it. And so I found this really fascinating, is that currently in the US job market, there's 82 million job openings. And this comes from the US Department of Labor. And there's only 6.5 million unemployed employees, which is why you see this gap between being able to fill jobs quickly with the right skill at the right time. And that doesn't even take a look at the skills people have, and in those job needed in those job openings, and the number of people unemployed in that. And I bet that the gap would be dramatically higher for things like data science and artificial intelligence in a number of areas. The other thing is that labor participation is now down to 62%. And most of that is because of an aging workforce we have here. And also we have a decline in international immigration to the US. And that used to keep our labor population up. So with that, you get some demographic shifts. So workers who are aging out are mostly white males. Women have been achieving higher education than men since the 1980s. Millennials and Gen Zs, they're more diverse, a generation than ever. And they're entering the workforce and seeking out diverse work environments. Obviously, technology and remote work has helped with us, but there's also some global migration patterns. So there's an increase in international migration that many countries bring diverse skills, perspectives, and cultural knowledge in. So like in Japan and in actually South Korea, they're actually, for the first time, actively looking to bring in talent from outside of the countries because they're having that issue with an aging workforce. And globally, ethnic minorities in Europe now have been about 10% of each country's population. So they need to start thinking about how do they attract that talent. And again, like I just said, they're adopting policies to attract skilled foreign workers. And you can see in places like Portugal, where they used to have a golden visa of if you actually had money, you could get your visa and move there. And now they've shifted it that if you're actually working, and bringing a skill into the country, then you can go there. So here's just some of the things to give you a perspective of whether it's going away or not. So corporate responses to everything I just talked about. Just recently, SHRM, which is the Society for Human Resource Management, it's the largest human resource association. I think they have almost 250,000 members. They just dropped equity from its DEI platform. Not everybody was happy with that, but what they said was they wanted to focus more on inclusion than they wanted to focus on equity. Companies have started the shift in dropping the term diversity, and they're starting to focus more on inclusive cultures, an open culture, a safe culture around inclusive leaders, and talking less about diversity. And that is something that's interesting. The aspect around allyship has gotten a very big renewed focus. It's about trying to engage everybody. Social mobility, from my perspective, is where a lot of this will go over the next 5 years. It already happens in places like the UK and in Europe, where they look less at race and ethnicity, and they look more at social mobility as a proxy for that. I believe a number of the universities in the US is looking at it from that perspective, as well as from, since they no longer can use race as part of their admissions. And also they're seeing this to be part of their DEI work as part of their sustainability strategy. And so it's moving a little bit out, for many companies, it's moving out of human resources or people and culture, and it's starting to move more and more into their sustainability strategy. At Volvo, one of our legs of our sustainability strategy is a responsible business. And part of that is around an inclusive organization. So we continue to focus on that internally. So aligning those DEIs with the business strategies is a big effort going on right now. And then also trying to understand their shareholders better and to shift shareholder proposals to DEI and balancing that DEI versus pro-DEI shareholder interest versus employees. We can see that fewer and people are coming to board meetings demanding DEI work or asking about DEI work, when 2 or 3 years ago it was top on the proxy statements. So here's some of the things that, because I don't believe that maybe the words DEI might change, but I think foundationally what this is about is for a company to really start thinking about how do they create something that's sustainable? How do they position themselves to attract a global talent workforce? How do they keep the people that they want? How do they actually take a look at the next generation? And where do they find talent they haven't found it before? But I think specifically they need to start thinking about how this contributes to better business decisions and outcomes, and to emphasize DE roles in preventing unintentional discrimination. I think there really is going to continue to be lawsuits on both sides, and I think that people need to protect themselves. I think there's also mitigating that legal and reputational risk. You can see with Bud Light had some very reputational implications to what they did around LGBT. I'm not saying what they did was right or wrong, but the way they reacted to it, I think, was completely wrong. And I think that's had both a short-term and a long-term impact on their sales. Avoid making sure that representation targets and executive comp isn't linked. There's nothing explicit in the law right now or in court cases, but I can see it coming. I believe that some companies have been approached in states like South Carolina and in Florida about does linking specific targets to executive pay cause the wrong behaviors, discriminatory behaviors. And then we need to take a look at how we talk to people, both internally and externally. And I think that for everybody, they need to start focusing on creating an environment where all employees feel that they belong. And like, for example, is that blind resume. A couple more slides and then we can kind of talk about it. So the future of DEI, and maybe you rebrand it to inclusion and belonging, which is what I did at Volvo, is that it's an evolving concept. So I think we need to keep thinking of it in that way. So to really start to take a look at about how this is driving genuine organizational and social change. And what's more important is align it to the company values and the mission. One of the things that we've done at Volvo is that every time we do one of our external ads or we make an investment in an external social change that we're looking for, we make sure that we align that with what we're doing for employees internally. So we're not doing something externally that we're not doing that's aligned to our vision and our values. Continue to take a look at the legal, but also start to focus on inclusion for all. And I think that's going to be the foundation going forward. More and more companies are moving that way. So I think everybody needs to re-energize what we're doing as a force for both social good, which is like social mobility, and for business success. I think you need to focus on both still. I think you need to proactively govern DEI in line with corporate values. I think that's really important to go back and look at your values and does it really support what you're talking about? And then to prepare for ongoing evolution and challenges in the DEI space. So these are just my final thoughts. And there may be some key principles and recommendations that you can take going forward. Because I don't believe it is going away. I think the work is not going away. I think the reasons why this work started is not going to go away. I think the next generation of employees will continue to demand it. And so I won't walk through all these because we can send the material out to people, but I think universal uniqueness, which is another way of saying that we take a look at diversity for everybody. Inclusive belonging, which means we want everybody to feel that they can thrive and be successful. I think we have to start to change our terminology a bit more towards inclusion and social mobility and culture and leadership. I think mutual allyship is a direction that we're seeing more and more companies starting to shift, that it's allies for one another. It's fostering a supportive, safe environment. We need to make it a business imperative. For a while, it went back to saying you do it because it's a good thing to do. I think more and more people, companies are starting to shift that it really needs to drive their values, their mission, their purpose. It is good for talent acquisition and the generations expect it, and we need to make it culturally relevant. So my recommendation to everybody is to conduct a comprehensive review of your DEI strategy, ensure that it's relevant to the current social and business landscapes today, make it future fit to adapt to the changing times and expectations, align it with both your local and global best practices, and you need to integrate it into your business operations and your culture. I believe that's the last slide, and that's just me. So you'll get a copy of that when you want.
Great. Good stuff. So I think that this frames the conversation exceptionally well. One of the things that you went through some of the questions that I had prepared in terms of how things are shifting, things like that. Looking at this from the perspective of, let's just take like your job is a real job. You're thinking about diversity, equity, inclusion on a consistent basis. How is success in your position judged? How do the executives of Volvo say, Jim's doing a good job?
Yeah, there's some classic ones which we do look at, things like turnover, retention. We do look at the diversity of our thinking. One of the things that we've started to do is not move away from looking at the diversity of the organization, because we still track like percentage of women, people with disability, those things. But we're starting to look at diversity of teams. And I think that's where the magic happens, is that if you can take a look at a team, and we looked at some of the more critical teams, such as our design team, because our design kind of sets the tone for whether people like the way the car looks, how it works, is it sustainable? It's like one of the key pieces. And also our engineering and R&D team, which is designing the inside of the car. So it's taking a look at those teams and looking at how diverse those teams are. And so we're looking at it from a cognitive diversity as well as other aspects. So we can look at a team from its nationality, its education, its tenure within the team, its generation it came from, its gender, and that's a starting point to take a look at it from 4 or 5 different dimensions. And then you can say, are we overbalanced in one area or the other? Are we missing a piece? And it's not to build the arc of having one of everything, but it's to say, are we representing who our clients are and our customers are and who's buying our car? Is it looking at where our future is going? And so there's nothing wrong with having kind of a consistent group within, but take a look at it, but what's the purpose of that group? Is it for innovation or is it for something else? And if it's to drive new ideas and to represent the world, then you can start looking at it not from an organizational perspective, but start looking at it from those key important teams. And so what we're looking at is then we are tracking innovation. We do look at patents we're doing. Those are some of the things we're looking at.
Gotcha. One of the things that you were talking about in terms of like South Korea and Japan starting to accept immigration, I think is so interesting because those countries are clearly getting old. China's getting old very rapidly. And I just think it's so interesting when we think about the demographic imbalance that's happening in, like, let's say Europe, North America, somewhat in South America, in Asia, and Africa. You've got like a explosion of the number of people that are going to be available. That's where the workforce is going to have to come from. Just wondering if you could comment on like how that demographic shift and how you think that we can access some of the talent that may exist elsewhere in the world as well.
Yeah, you're right about Africa. It is potentially the future. Maybe not in the next 5 years, but in the next 10, 20 years, to actually be where talent is coming from. The way we're doing it is looking at it from our graduate programs and being very intentional about creating a kind of a global graduate program. I believe this year it's close to 75 or 80% of the people who are in our graduate program are not coming from where our corporate headquarters is. And so we're starting to get that. So we're looking at it both from a nationality perspective, and we're looking at it from a gender perspective. But that gives us a sense of like we're starting to figure out where talent is coming from. We're also starting to do a little bit more in places like Shanghai. It's a place that has a really interesting tech capabilities that we're looking at, and that works for us in Sweden. But I think people need to think outside the box on this. And what's happening is obviously with remote work, that's going to happen. We just for an example for us, we when I got here a couple of years ago, we were pretty much almost all based in Sweden. And now we have operations in Poland. We have operations in Slovakia. We have set up a center in Madrid. Our India offices have tripled in size. So we've really started to have a different model of operating with those hubs, and that's really kind of tapping into some of that talent.
So again, going back to you directly on this, so you were living in a pretty good area. You were in the Sonoma-Napa Valley area, doing a lot of good work. And you said, hey, I'm going to pick up my family. I'm going to move to Sweden and still be thinking about, the diversity, equity, inclusion area and how we're creating a better workforce. What's that experience been like for you in terms of what have you learned going to Sweden as opposed to when you were on the West Coast of the United States?
Sweden is an amazing country, and we love it here. What's interesting is that it starts with a foundation of equality, and it starts with a foundation that everybody is equal, and that is an interesting way to start the conversation. What's the challenge has been is then to talk about differences, because that goes against their culture. It goes against how they think about things. And so as we've started to become more a global company, it's opened up that conversation to cultural differences. And we've expanded a lot of our focus around LGBT when before it was pretty much everybody in the country. What I've found interesting is the aspect around immigration and the impact. I know we experienced that in the US, but in a different way. But immigration here is something that is both loved and feared at the same time. They want highly qualified people to come into their country and contribute, but they also want people to adopt their culture, their language, and to be part of the country. And so it's this real push and pull between, so are you an American or are you Swedish? Or are you an American in Sweden? Or are you a Brit in England, in Sweden, or actually are you Swedish and you happen to have an American background? And so it's an interesting thing about nationalities and cultures, about how they start to blend together and where that goes.
Great. And, as we're thinking about, this is changing. You made that very clear that, how we think about this is changing. And there's going to be activities that companies have done that have worked out okay and ones that haven't. Is there any sort of commonality you can think about in terms of what are some of the things that companies have done that just haven't worked so great and we want to be cautious of?
Yeah, it's interesting. So I've said this a number of times before, but when I've been with companies where their primary focus has been women in senior leadership is that's the right focus, but it tends to dominate 90% of the conversation and 90% of the reporting and maybe a large chunk of the budget. And so, for an example, for a company like ours, we're 45,000 employees. Our senior leadership is 350 people. For us to move from our 30%, 32% up to 40%, which is one of our targets, you're talking about 20 people. So, and these are people who are already in very privileged positions because they're already super senior level people. And so the rest of the organization hears about this and they like to see role models, but the 44,000 people, except for those 20, feel like it doesn't relate to them. And so I think what has to happen is that you have to make this conversation about everybody, and everybody needs to see how they contribute and how they benefit from it. And I believe that that's probably the biggest shift you can make is continue to focus on women in senior leadership and those good efforts like that, and around underrepresented groups and people of color and LGBT and people with disabilities. Those are all things you have to continue to focus on. But I think you need to think about how you engage everybody so that no matter where you are in the organization, you're excited about the work that's happening because you know that it'll help and benefit you in some way.
Great. So you said, hey, this is going to be important going forward because your employee base is going to be asking for it. Shifting that a little bit, what are boards asking for in this area? What do they want to know, and what do they think? What actions do you think they're saying companies should take?
Yeah, boards are interesting. Depends on the maturity level of them, and but I've done a number of board presentations, and I've also coached a lot of our leaders when they're doing board presentations around this topic and some other ones. And so what the board tends to care about the most in this topic, one is reputation, because they want to make sure that we're positioning the company in a safe way. They're concerned about getting sued. Are we protecting ourselves? So there's a legal perspective of it. There's a reputational perspective of it because that drives shareholder price. And they also take a look at it from, are you creating a sustainable organization? So the last presentation that we're putting together is around succession planning for our board, for our most senior leaders. And we're talking about how an inclusive and diverse organization helps build that very robust, strong pipeline so that we have leaders ready for when we need them. And so that's been one of their bigger focuses.
Interesting. Okay, and then thinking about the folks who are in the leadership positions of the company, what are they asking for? What are executives asking for around this?
Well, it goes across the board. Some of them see this as their legacy, and so they want to be seen as a progressive, forward-thinking, innovative leader. And so they see this as a way for them to kind of set that tone and create followership, but also drive more innovation. And so I think part of it is that. Part of it is honestly compliance. They're like, okay, well, we need to do this. The company wants to do this. We have to do this. The ones that are super smart about it actually look at it like Mark Cuban did, which is I need to get the best people I possibly can. I need to get people that think differently than me. And so it's about how you create a high-performing team when you have a lot of diversity. And one of the things we've talked about, we do an inclusion index to see how inclusive our organization is, and we can do it at a team level. And sometimes we find that the most inclusive teams that score the highest on our inclusion index are the most homogeneous, because they know each other's ways, they know what they're doing, they're easy to make a decision. It feels good in that meeting because we all follow the same football team, we all go to the same, we all have that commonality. And at times when we find some of the more innovative teams who are driving bigger decisions, there's a lot more conflict. And so that inclusion score doesn't necessarily go up high, because what they're trying to do is get to the best answer. And so they walk away feeling like, boy, that was a tough meeting, but we did it. And so I think that's to get the leaders to understand how to be in difficult conversations, and how to have that conflict, that constructive conflict. And for me, it starts with the leader understanding themselves, being comfortable with who they are, and not having to know all the answers.
I love that reframing, because it's like, hey, when you had a meeting and everyone's high-fiving at the end of it, that might be when you got to worry a little bit.
Yeah, everybody agrees with me. That was a great meeting. Yeah. It's like, wait, let's rethink.
And I think the Mark Cuban example is fascinating, right? Because the NBA essentially they tried to say, hey, how can we find all the 7-footers in the world? They know like the some of the characteristics that they're trying to locate, and so it's like, hey, they could be in India, they could be in Africa, they could be wherever.
Yeah.
So really interesting. I want to open this up. We've got plenty of people on who are going to have some good questions. I would like to invite all the folks who are on to be able, if you'd like to come on camera, great, and ask a question to Jim. If you'd like to put it in the chat instead, you're welcome to. But April, you're good to go. So have at it.
Thanks, Matt. Hi, Jim. I'm sorry I started a little bit late and I didn't get the full intro, but thank you so much for all you've shared already. I have a question that I don't really know the answer, but one of the things in the US that has impacted DEI is return to office, where now organizations don't have the same pool of applicants that they had, when we were working more remotely. Has that been the same in Europe?
Good question, because we have a less of a return to work policy, but I think the way we frame it is work happens in the office. And so they want you there as often as possible. But you could be someplace else, but they like to have you there because they really do believe that interaction makes a big difference. And, yeah. And I can say it can and it can't. I've worked a lot of remote roles myself personally. So most of the companies are asking people to come back. But you can see what I just said, because we have a hard time attracting talent to relocate to where we are. And it's a beautiful town. I relocated, but we can't do that with everybody. And so we're starting to do things in a different way. So that pull it off. A good example is our chief marketing officer, Gretchen. She's amazing. And originally when we did the search for that, we said the person has to be located in Gothenburg, Sweden. And we ended up having 6 candidates, of which 3 were women and 3 were men. And nobody was interested in the job except for one man. And our CEO, because they had to relocate. And our CEO said, we need to keep looking for the best candidate, not just who's willing to relocate. And so we found Gretchen, and she's based out of New York. And she does come back to Sweden a couple times a month, but she is based out of New York. And so I think when that talented person is the right person with the right skills, then there's that opportunity to have it happen. So I think a lot of the people who are being forced to come back are people that the company feels like they can replace if they have to.
Thank you.
Well, I think to your point, like this is not going away. The companies that are getting started right now, there's a lot of them that are going to be remote. And so, the younger group of people, they're going to be asking for that. Brenda, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Hi, Jim. And I apologize. I was also tardy. So not exactly sure from some of the angles from which you're coming at this work. I also do DEI work. I just kind of want to, note a couple things that I find may create loopholes, at least in the short term, and be excessively harmful to the work that we've been doing for DEI for decades. The note about shareholder interests, John Deere specifically was one of our customers, and then all of a sudden decided that they're not a customer. We've also seen people be concerned about their reputation and, shareholder interests. And those to me are dog whistles, or can be dog whistles for, and also, what did I write down? The focusing on inclusion for all. And sorry, this is going to be controversial. Sounds like all lives matter. And so I feel like in this situation that we find ourselves in, there are those of us who have, I think, the right intentions, have always had the right intentions about this work. There are those who've never had the right intentions about this work. And so using covers like, well, my shareholders aren't interested, or my customers will be offended. It's like, where is the counterweight balance to the actual impact on the workforce and the communities that those companies actually draw their wealth from and should be serving? And so I just kind of wanted to raise that. I'm hearing these words, and they can be used in the right way, but they also can tend towards classism and definitely racism. Even in your comment about what are the type of things we're considering, I noticed you did not mention race at all. And can you find people from different, backgrounds? And yes, always, yes. But the push for me in particular space feels like a backlash that covers for being able to exclude in their inclusion. And so I feel like the education that we have to do around the words that we use and what they actually mean to various communities, to shareholders. We can find talent from anywhere. That's always been the case. But if that becomes a cover for not finding talent in various places because you don't want to use the D word or the equity word, can be problematic. And I'm just kind of bringing this up is to say the pendulum will swing. It's swinging. What do you see as the collateral damage that potentially we will be working within, both globally as well as in the U.S., because we're also global. We have a company in India, we have communities in Europe, and so we're addressing these things, from a different cultural intelligence, not just exporting Silicon Valley, which is where my company is based. And so, I'll stop there. It's so much I could say, but, would like your perspective on those things.
Yeah. I believe that you're right. You can take these words and you can make them what you think you want to hear or not want to hear. And so, inclusion for all doesn't mean that we treat everybody in the exact same way. And it doesn't mean we don't stop doing what we've always done, which is to look for underrepresented groups, look for people who have been disadvantaged, look at people who have barriers to get into the company or to be promoted, that we continue to do every one of those things. At least we do at our company. And so the work hasn't stopped. But what we've done is been able to have everybody in the company, we use the term freedom to be who you are. And so that gives everybody the chance to say, yeah, I can be who I am, and I don't have to fit into one of these groups. I can be who I am, or I can fit in and be in many of these groups. And so we tend to go out from that point. And maybe I've been here in Sweden or working for Volvo for a couple years too long, is we can't use the word race legally because it goes back to Germany and the superior race. And so it is a word that we cannot use. And we don't talk about race. We do talk about it in the US, but we don't talk about it in Sweden. And they don't talk about it in Germany, and they don't talk about it in many places in Europe. And so we talk about ethnicity, we talk about nationalities, we try to find proxies for all that. But it's a challenging conversation when you're, it's a challenging conversation anywhere in the world. But it's one that, it gets the communication team crosses it out every time I put it in something, because it's just not how we can do it legally, which is interesting. But I agree with you that you can take this and say inclusion for all means that you treat everybody exactly the same way, and that we don't have to think about differences at all because everybody is equal. And so you have to be careful with that, just like you said.
I think one more thing I want to say is we also need to address centering. Like what is the norm and that we're driving towards? So centering is an issue that we all need to think about. Whose culture is centered?
And exactly, it's where you're standing in that world at that moment, and that could change. It's not a fixed piece. So it's, if this was easy, you know, we wouldn't be, I wouldn't be here and neither would you. And so, yeah, it's interesting, but I really appreciate it, because if we don't have these kind of open conversations, then they never happen, and you can't have them in the dark. You have to have them in the light. And so thank you. I appreciate it.
Yeah. I mean, I think self-examination, we got to consistently be doing that. And you got to have other people who are asking you questions in order for you to come up with some of the right ones. Jason, go ahead. What's your question?
So, Mr. Rottman, I appreciate the conversation, and certainly a challenging one as well. Not an easy conversation to have. So my question is probably maybe a little bit easier to answer, in that in some of the material I've read, you know, in the last few months, it appears as though the younger generations have an easier time. I shouldn't say an easier time. To them, inclusion and just diverse groups are a standard makeup. It's a standard component of how they're growing up. So my question is, as boards are getting younger or new generations are moving in, as executives of younger generations are moving into those seats, are you seeing this idea of DEI being the only way being phased out, not because they don't appreciate diversity, equity, inclusion, but because to them, it's just a norm for them, and they are going to be seeking out the best, the brightest from across all groups? To them, it's not a thing because they've grown up with diversity their whole lives? Or is this something that are in small pockets that we will continue to have to wrestle with for the next 2 or 3 generations?
That's a great question, because I had the same question myself. And so I met with we have a young in career, early in career group, about 1,500 people. And we met with them and did a session and tried to get as much information on what they expect and what they don't expect. Because I wanted to start designing things, not for people today, which we need to do, but also put things in place so that in 5-10 years, we've already stopped something that we don't have to fix. And it was interesting. They think it is the norm, but they come into a company like ours and they still see white men and mostly European in leadership. So their challenge is like, why don't we have more role models? Why aren't you? So that's kind of the focus that we're trying to get to, is start to build more role models and more understanding the path to success when you don't see yourself in that role. And that's what they're expecting. And then I had one that just kind of was really fascinating to me. Was we were over during our Pride Month. We had a couple of people in our company talk about coming out, and that they talked about that challenge. And I got a lot of comments from that younger group and said, I don't understand. What do you mean coming out? This is just the way we are. Why would you have to come out? I don't understand that concept. And so for me, that was like a complete shift. I mean, I learn every day from people. I mean, like a complete shift of like, why would you come out if it's like you said, it's just the way everybody is. So there's nothing to come out about. And I was like, there's a different mind shift there that I need to think about, that maybe, was not my mindset. So that might give you some indication of how some people think about it. And again, it's cultural, right? Because if you're in different countries, you don't ever come out. If in other countries, it's not an issue. So it's what centering is, like she was talking about. Is like, what is that in what we're looking for? Good question, though, because I appreciate it.
We got 2 minutes, so we got time for one more question if someone's got one.
I would love to hear your response to the SHRM announcement.
I think it's crazy. I think it's absolutely bonkers. I have no idea who thought of that. And it makes absolutely no sense. Equity to me is like foundational. And it's just like, what? I don't know if they'll flip it and go back, but I would recommend that they do.
I have one more comment and would love to hear what you think about it. You talked about shareholder interests and values of the company. I have the opinion that tech companies have a lot of power and could be pushing back against a lot of this drama versus running for the bunkers. What do you think about that?
I think they think about cognitive diversity before they think about other things around diversity. And it's the fight for people with AI capabilities, is that they don't care who you are if you can do it. And so if you were
you've seen some that's not actually true in American companies. So
but my guess is that if you had an AI background, they would talk to you.
Timnit Gebru, Joy Bolamwini. I mean, I can name some Black women who have been, I hate the term, blacklisted because, and
yes,
they had right.
Yes, because they went against they tried to fight the system, and the system won, and they were right about doing what they did. And you see whistleblowers across the world, no matter what it is, get punished. And they got punished, and they shouldn't have. And
Francis Haugen.
Yep,
right.
It was like completely wrong. But I'm just saying that I think tech companies tend to focus more on skills than anything else, and at least in the skills that they need the most. I don't know. You can take a look at a lot of companies, and if we can start to get back to the education system, we need to get back to not people thinking that they have to have degrees in order to get into these roles. We need to go back to thinking about what all this looks differently. Then change will happen. So I agree with you that the tech companies could do a lot if they wanted, but Elon Musk doesn't seem to want to do a lot.
Thank you. Thank you.
That's one way to say it.
Yeah.
Thank you all.
Exceptional conversation. Thanks so much for the thoughtful questions. Jim, total pleasure to have you talking to our folks. This has made me think a lot. Hopefully it's helping us all think a lot. And obviously we haven't got everything figured out just yet. So we got opportunities to talk more in the future.
But if anybody wants to continue the conversation, you can find me on LinkedIn. You know where to find me.
Thank you.
All right.
Thanks, Jim. Thanks, Jim.
Have a good day, guys.
Bye.
See ya.
Okay. Thanks, Matt.